Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to continue our read through of Lost Cities, Ancient Tombs. This will be chapter 3, covering 3000 to 1500 BCE, the foundations of society. So let's just dive right in. Chapter 17, I suppose. Part 3, chapter 17. The dawn of ancient Egypt. This is in 2900 BCE in Abydos, Egypt, and of course it's Egyptian. A royal burial ground reveals startling clues about funerary practices during a formative period for civilization along the Nile. There we go. King Aha, the fighter, was not killed while unifying the Nile's two warring kingdoms, nor while building the capital of Memphis. The details of his demise are hazy, but one history of Egypt written many centuries later suggests that the first ruler of a unified Egypt was killed in a hunting accident after a reign of 62 years, unceremoniously trampled to death by a rampaging hippopotamus. News of his demise surely brought a separate, special terror to his staff. For many, the honor of serving the king in life would lead to the more dubious distinction of serving the king in death. On the day of Aha's burial, experts believe a solemn procession made its way through the sacred precinct of Abydos, the royal necropolis of Egypt's first kings. Led by priests in flowing white gowns, the funeral retinue included the royal family, vizier, treasurer, administrators, trade and tax officers, and Aha's successor, Jer. Just beyond the town's gates, the procession stopped at a monumental structure with imposing brick walls surrounding an open plaza. Inside the walls, the priests waded through a cloud of incense to a small chapel where they performed cryptic rites to seal Aha's immortality. Outside, situated around the enclosure's walls, were 6 open graves. In a final act of devotion or coercion, 6 people were poisoned and buried along with wine and food to take into the afterlife. One was a child of just 4 or 5 who was expensively furnished with ivory bracelets and tiny lapis beads. The procession then headed westward into the setting sun, crossing sand dunes and moving up a dry riverbed to a remote cemetery at the base of a high desert plateau. Here, Aha's 3-chambered tomb was stockpiled with provisions for a lavish life in eternity. There were large cuts of ox meat, freshly killed water birds, loaves of bread, cheese, dried figs, jars of beer, and dozens of wine vessels, each bearing Aha's official seal. Beside his tomb, more than 30 graves were laid out in 3 neat rows. As Aha's body was lowered into a brick-lined chamber, a select group of loyal courtiers and servants took poison and joined their king in the next world. Is this how an Egyptian king's funeral in 2900 BCE actually unfolded? It's a plausible scenario, experts say. For more than a century, archaeologists have been drilling through the dry sands of the immense royal burial center at Abydos, 260 miles up the Nile from Cairo. Now they have found compelling evidence that ancient Egyptians indeed engaged in human sacrifice, shedding new light on one of the most celebrated ancient civilizations of all. Work on the graves and ceremonial funerary enclosures from Egypt's first dynasty has uncovered evidence from a pivotal period when Aha and other kings laid down the roots of religion, government, and architecture that would last for the next 3,000 years. All of the first dynasty tombs and most of the enclosures excavated so far are accompanied by subsidiary graves, hundreds in some cases, containing the remains of elite officials and courtiers. Egyptologists have long speculated that these graves might hold victims of sacrifice, but also acknowledged that they could simply be graves reserved for the king's staff. Let's see here. Talk about those in a second. Ready to use as each person died naturally. When British archaeologist W.M. Flinders Petrie excavated heavily looted First Dynasty tombs in the early 1900s, he found 35 subsidiary graves besides Ahat's tomb. Although he didn't dwell on it in his published papers, he hinted at human sacrifice. Modern experts also believe the evidence strongly suggests this scenario because it's unlikely that 41 people, 6 at Aha's enclosure plus 35 at his tomb, would have died of natural causes at the same time, and the skeletons showed no signs of trauma. The method of their demise is still a mystery, explained Associate Dig Director Matthew Adams. My guess is that they were drugged. Sorry if you hear my cat snoring over there. Anyway. Enthusiasm for this grim practice seems to have waned quickly, though. By the Second Dynasty, it had simply stopped. Instead, funerary statuettes began to appear. In time, grave goods began to include legions of shoptees, small figurines that were meant to magically come alive in the afterlife to serve the deceased. This period at Abydos also suggests that boats were thought to be crucial elements of the afterlife. In 1991, Dig Director David O'Connor found an eerie fleet of 14 wooden vessels, each buried in an enormous brick-lined grave. Hence the boats here. Huge wooden boats brought to this desert location make quite a statement of royal power and privilege, said O'Connor's colleague Matthew Adams. Let me stop the cat from snoring real quick. Hey, buddy. Okay. I had to wake him up. Measuring up to 75 feet long, the boats were expertly crafted and had been fully functional when buried. Later studies revealed that they were likely made of local tamarisk wood for an early ruler, perhaps even Aha. They proved to be the world's oldest surviving boats built of planks, as opposed to those made of reeds or hollowed-out logs. The boats are like the servants who were buried at Abydos, said O'Connor. The king intended to use them in the afterlife in the same manner that he used them before his death. In life, the boats enabled the kings to travel rapidly up and down the Nile in a powerful display of wealth and military might. Because the Egyptian kings also expected to be kings in the afterlife, the boats would be useful tools. It was a concept that would endure as a key element of religious imagery for the rest of the pharaonic era, a sign of hope that in the wake of death comes eternal life. Untold riches in Ur's royal tombs, 2600 to 2300 BCE in Iraq, and it's Sumerian. The historic excavation unearthed a royal cemetery bursting with treasure and hints of mass human sacrifice. It started with 2 trenches, dug without much ceremony by hundreds of workmen hired in 1922 by Leonard Woolley, a British archaeologist tasked with turning a dust-swept floodplain into the largest archaeological dig in Iraq's history. From those 2 trenches would emerge the ancient city of Ur, and a network of royal tombs bursting with some of antiquity's most stunning treasures. Shifting sands had swallowed the city itself, but at least the towering peak of the ziggurat stayed visible. The first extensive excavation was a joint mission mounted by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum. They commissioned Woolley to lead the project based on his experience excavating in Crete, Turkey, and Egypt, and the daring he'd shown as an intelligence officer for British forces during World War I. But the intrepid archaeologist's strongest qualification was his exacting approach to archaeology. Yes, he longed to pull a cache of riches from the sand. But he wouldn't allow the excavation to delve into a mere treasure hunt. Only by proceeding methodically would his team be able to peel back the layers of time all the way to the city's founders. The ancient city of Ur played an important role in Sumerian society. Located about 140 miles southeast of Babylon, in what is now Iraq, it was once a bustling urban center due to its strategic positioning near the juncture of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in fertile Mesopotamia. It is also mentioned in the Bible as the hometown of the biblical patriarch Abraham. One of the first cities in the world, Ur was dominated by its distinctive ziggurat, a stepped pyramid built of mud brick. Ur's patron deity, Nana, would choose a woman to serve as high priestess by sending an omen to the royal family. Usually the king's daughter, the priestess would live on the temple platform, perform ceremonial duties, and serve as the god's human wife. Beginning in the 3rd millennium BCE, Ur became a bureaucratic and cultural hub of 20 to 30 competing city-states. Under 3 different dynasties, it witnessed the technological, cultural, and urban flourishing of a people credited with inventing the hallmarks of civilization as we know it, including law, urban planning, and writing. In one of Woolley's trenches, the team found ruins. In the other, gold artifacts. They were excited to pursue what they called the Gold Trench, but Woolley put off digging for what he suspected was a complex of tombs. Not only were his men too inexperienced to tackle a complicated burial excavation, Woolley was convinced they had stolen some of the gold and precious stones that had already been uncovered. Instead, he had the team focus on the ziggurat and the public buildings they unearthed around it. At last, during his 5th season at the site, Woolley gave the green light to work on the Gold Trench. In just 3 months, they uncovered over 600 tombs. Within 8 years, they would uncover almost 2,000 burials. Assisted by a young British archaeologist named Max Malone, Woolley meticulously oversaw the slow, careful excavation. Among the most impressive tombs in the cemetery complex was the tomb of a woman identified as Queen Puabi. Her entire body was strewn with precious beads, and her fingers were adorned with 10 rings. She wore an elaborate headdress sparkling with golden leaves and strings of lapis lazuli and carnelian beads, which field assistant Catherine Keeling painstakingly reconstructed from the surviving fragments. Possessions like makeup and a chariot also spoke to her wealth and position. The bodies of servants and soldiers surrounded her. In another chamber, which Woolley called the Great Death Pit, were the bodies of 6 men and 68 elaborately dressed women arranged in careful order. As we cleared the shaft, it appeared almost as if we were treading on a carpet of gold. Such was the wealth of jewelry, Malouin later wrote. Woolley had a less glamorous take on the excavation. "I'm sick to death of getting out gold headdresses," he wrote. The number of bodies, the relative lack of men, and the arrangement of the corpses fascinated the archaeologists, who surmised that the deceased had taken some kind of poison before the burial. Later analysis has shown that at least some of the people buried in the tombs had suffered blunt force head trauma, supporting a hypothesis that the dead were killed and taken into the tomb and arranged before rigor mortis set in. It remains unclear if the bodies represent willing victims or coerced sacrifices. For Malouin, the site also yielded another kind of treasure. He met his future wife, detective novelist Agatha Christie, on the dig. Christie, who was fascinated by archaeology, would later set Murder in Mesopotamia on an archaeological dig in Iraq, and dedicated her novel, Murder on the Orient Express, to Malouin. They were not the only match made at the excavation site. Catherine Keeling took on the role as second in command of the dig and later married Woolley, though hers was a marriage of convenience, as British society wouldn't tolerate a single woman working as an archaeologist. All in all, the expedition yielded tens of thousands of artifacts, now housed in the British Museum, the University of Pennsylvania's museum, and Iraq's State Museum. The treasure's undeniable allure draws crowds to this day, but Woolley's greater wish came true. The Sumerians are recognized for their pioneering contributions to human civilization. That's funny. Peaceful cities of the Indus Valley, 2500 to 1900 BCE, the Indus Valley in Pakistan, and of course they're Indus. Ruined cities Mohenjo-daro and Harappa reveal advanced urban planning and sophisticated writing. Was this achieved without a ruler or an army? In the 1850s, British railroad builders in the Indus Valley needed ballast for a new track. They sent laborers into Punjab province, where the latter found piles of old bricks to cart away. When archaeological surveyor Rakaldis Banerjee began excavating in the area some 7 decades later, it became clear those railway workers had unwittingly scattered rare evidence of the ancient Indus culture's surprisingly urban sophistication. One of the most rewarding sites proved to be Harappa. Nearly 400 acres in size and with 20,000 or more inhabitants, Harappa was among the largest cities of a civilization that flourished from roughly 2500 to 1900 BCE along the Indus and other rivers in Pakistan and India. Harappa was spread over 5 large mounds that expanded over the centuries as people continually raised houses and laid down streets over the constructions of their ancestors. Harappa was probably one of many urban centers linked by trade and kinship that made up what is usually known today as the Indus civilization. The Indus territory was a Texas-sized 250,000 square miles, reaching from the Arabian Sea north to the Himalayan foothills and east to New Delhi. The Indus people employed the wheel for transport as well as to turn pottery, and they were the first to make large-scale use of fire-hardened bricks in construction. The people of Harappa left behind more than piles of bricks, however. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of examples of script, leading them to believe that the people of Harappa developed the earliest form of writing known in the Indian subcontinent. Seals the size of a postage stamp, usually of stone, bear writing as well as carved figures that may be deities. But despite the efforts of many scholars, the symbols have yet to yield a credible sentence, a major reason that the Indus culture, surely one of the greatest of the ancient world, has remained vexingly obscure. To try to solve all the riddles is like picking up pebbles on a seashore, confessed Indian archaeologist Ravindra Singh Bisht. Maybe even more significant are the things not found. No remains of great temples such as Mesopotamia's, or sumptuous tombs such as those that ushered Egypt's pharaohs to the next world. In other words, no evidence of a kingship or theocracy. Rather, what we see in Harappa is an elaborate middle-class society, says archaeologist Richard Meadow, whose years of work with his colleague J. Mark Kenoyer has broadened and deepened our knowledge of the Indus culture. Wow. The archaeologists wonder if Harappa even had an army. Although a few weapons have been unearthed, no carved pieces depict war scenes like those in the sculpture and texts of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Check out the picture. It's Mohenjo-daro. Other finds indicate that Harappa was a city of craftsmen and traders. Its merchants probably sent goods to other Indus urban centers and also to Oman and the Persian Gulf region. Working several kinds of stone, gold, and silver, artisans turned out exquisite jewelry. More than 60 sites have yielded seals and tokens. Traders supplied Harappan artisans with raw materials such as lapis lazuli in what is now Afghanistan. From the Arabian Sea, 500 miles to the south, came conch shells to be sawed into bangles. From artifacts like these, it seems clear that as many as 53 centuries ago, the Harappan people were linked to a vast trade network. Much of that trade likely traveled on the Ravi River, eventually reaching the Indus. Some of it surely went by that river to Mohenjo-daro, Harappa's sister city, some 400 miles to the south. A well-planned street grid and an elaborate drainage system hint that the city's occupants were skilled urban planners with a reverence for the control of water. Sitting on elevated ground, Mohenjo-daro spread out over about 250 acres on a series of mounds like Harappa. According to Kenoyer, I hope I'm saying that right, the mounds grew organically over the centuries as people kept building platforms and walls for their houses. Also like Harappa, Mohenjo-daro lacks ostentatious palaces, temples, or monuments, despite the evidence of its wealth and stature. With no obvious central seat of government or evidence of a king or queen, it was likely governed as a city-state, perhaps staffed by elected officials or elites from each of the mounds. Modesty, order, and cleanliness were apparently important. Pottery and tools of copper and stone were standardized. Seals and weights suggest a system of tightly controlled trade. A watertight pool called the Great Bath, perched on top of a mound of dirt and held in place with walls of baked brick, is the closest structure Mohenjo-daro has to a temple. After 1,000 years of resilience, the Indus civilization faded from history. Paleoclimatologists point to a 200-year drought that began around 2000 BCE and suspended monsoon rains in the Indus Valley at the same time as the drought threatened civilizations across Bronze Age civilizations in Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia. Archaeologists puzzle over the few clues that may indicate the reason for the Indus cities' decline. Kenoyer suggests that the Indus River changed course, which would have hampered the local agricultural economy, and Mohenjo-daro's importance as a center of trade. But no evidence exists that flooding destroyed the city, and the city wasn't totally abandoned, Kenoyer says. Enough of the structures remained to evoke a sense of awe among the first archaeologists who arrived to survey the site in 1922. The survey's director, Englishman John Marshall, wrote that the Indus people possessed an advanced and singularly uniform civilization, in some respects even superior to that of contemporary Mesopotamia and Egypt. Although he was an appointee of the Empire of Great Britain, Marshall promoted Indian scholarship and advocated for the artifacts to stay on the subcontinent rather than be shipped back to Britain. His dedication to conservation alongside discovery helped preserve this priceless World Heritage Site. Now future generations of archaeologists have a chance to decipher the mysteries of the Indus Valley. Egypt's pyramid builders. 2550 to 2470 BCE in Giza, Egypt, and it's Egyptian. Excavations have revealed the lives of the laborers and overseers who raised the monumental wonders at Giza more than 4,000 years ago. Mention ancient Egypt to most people and they will likely think of the Sphinx and the 3 great pyramids at Giza, which today make up the most famous site from the Old Kingdom. That familiarity makes it easy to forget that basic questions about that early time have remained unanswered. Only within the past few decades have Egyptologists began to fill in the gaps, sifting through the sands for clues about enduring monuments and the people who built them. Archaeologist Mark Lehner has been working on Giza's desert plateau for more than 40 years. We focus too much on how the pyramids are built, he says. I'm less interested in how the Egyptians built the pyramids than in how the pyramids built Egypt. His excavations have gradually uncovered evidence of the lives of the pyramid workers and of the impact that the immense construction projects had on the country as a whole. Imagine yourself as a 15-year-old kid in some rural village of about 200 people, the 27th century BCE, says Lehner. One day the pharaoh's men come. They say you and you and you. You get on a boat and sail down the Nile. You don't even know where you're going or why. Eventually you come around a bend and you see this huge geometric structure like nothing you've ever known. There are hundreds of people working on it. They put you to work. And someone keeps track of you. Your name, your hours, your rations. All this was a profoundly socializing experience. You might go back to your village, but you would never again be the same. In the early 1990s, Lehner and Zahi Hawass, then Director General of the Giza Pyramids and Saqqara, began to excavate 2 sites near the pyramids in their search for signs of the pyramid builders. Within months, they hit pay dirt. Lehner found a pair of adjacent mud brick rooms that were Egypt's oldest known bakery. Its ovens once turned out golden loaves of bread, a staple food of the workers, along with beef, fish, and hearty beer. Next door, Lehner would uncover a large building, likely a commissary for the workers. South of the Sphinx lay the remains of a community where as many as 20,000 people may have lived, and barracks where 2,000 people could have slept at one time. Hawass, meanwhile, unearthed a cemetery of some 600 tombs nearby, the graves of workers. He discovered evidence of toil in their skeletons, their vertebrae compressed and damaged by years of carrying heavy loads. Some were missing fingers and even limbs. A few of the tombs were adorned with mini pyramids several feet high made of mud brick. Nothing like them had been found before. In the past, experts believed that the pyramid-shaped tomb was invented for royalty, but Hawass argued the pyramid form may have arisen among the common people. He believed that the mini pyramids evolved from sacred mounds found in tombs long before the Old Kingdom, the first era of royal dynasties after independent regions had been unified in one country. The pyramids built for the kings may have been, so us put it, just more endearing examples of traditional folk architecture. In the work of these archaeologists and others may lie the origins of a whole new way of seeing the Old Kingdom, not just as a brilliant civilization of the elite trickling down to the masses, but also as a culture built from the bottom up, standing on the daily toil of workers and the very beliefs and values of ordinary men and women. From excavation and from scenes carved on the walls of tombs, researchers have begun to fill in the details of everyday life at Giza. A pyramid, the mystical gateway for a king's leap to the afterlife, drew resources from all of Egypt. From a population of as many as 1.5 million souls, farm workers were conscripted into national service in a rotating roster, while provincial shipments of crops and domesticated animals fed workers and managers during construction. It was a coming together of people from throughout the land, says Lehner. By coming and working in this place, it socialized information and bound all these disparate areas, these provinces, into a whole. It was really the beginning of Egyptian unity. The labor was certainly hard. For one pyramid, workers hauled an estimated 23 million limestone and granite blocks, most weighing 2.5 tons, and possibly set a block in place every 2.5 minutes. Although Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, declared that 100,000 men were needed to build one of the Giza pyramids, Lehner calculated that as few as 10,000 could have pulled off the job. As he put it, a pyramid turns out to be a very doable thing. The entire Egyptian society was built around a preoccupation with these preparations for the king's immortal life. But why? What held the Old Kingdom together was not so much a belief in the divine nature of the king as a belief that through the king was expressed the divine nature of society itself, explained German archaeologist Rainer Stadelmann. Much later, after the fall of the Old Kingdom, Egypt would become something like a police state. But in the Old Kingdom, the people really believed in the importance of building a pyramid. It's like a small town that builds a huge cathedral in the Middle Ages. Faith is the spur. Next is the Princess of Kokphenamdi. I hope that's how it's pronounced. 2000 to 1500 BCE in Thailand. It's Neolithic. A mysterious woman buried with over 120,000 shimmering handmade beads is recovered from a bountiful burial plot in Thailand that spans 20 generations. Environmental changes can make it hard or impossible to recover the archaeological remains of past societies, particularly in ocean-bound communities. But in Thailand, a multi-generational cemetery survived thousands of years of rising and falling sea levels, bearing witness to those climate cycles and preserving information on how the area's inhabitants adapted over time. That alone would have made Kokphenamdi worth excavating. Then archaeologists uncovered a stunning grave, Thailand's Princess Dai. Oh, maybe it's Kokphenamdi then. Princess Dai, a mysterious woman who brought exquisite wealth with her into the afterlife, and whose careful preservation shed light on the funeral rituals and daily lives of her people. In 1984, archaeologist Charles Hayam was working on another dig in Thailand when his colleagues told him about Kokphenamdi. Let's go for that. A large burial mound on the floodplain of the Bang Pakong River near the Gulf of Thailand. Hayam and his colleagues dug through 30 feet of deposits and uncovered layer after layer of graves. The bones covered 17 to 20 generations, 154 graves in all. You know, if you're Thai or know how to pronounce this, let me know in the comments. I do want to know. Only a few months into the dig, Hayam unearthed a pyramid of clay cylinders. Things were getting exciting, he later recalled. Down we went, over a meter, until suddenly the grave fill turned blood red. It was red ochre, and some of it covered a human skull. Inside the grave lay a woman's skeleton, a variety of pottery vessels, and equipment thought to be used to create pottery. Her entire skeleton was covered in beads. The woman had been buried near 2 children. One of them, an 18-month-old baby, was also covered in ochre and buried with thousands of shell beads and a miniature potter's anvil. Ultimately, we counted over 120,000 disc beads that had been stitched onto at least 2, possibly 3 garments of a woman who died probably in her 30s, Hayam later wrote. She would literally have dazzled in reflected sunlight when she walked across Kokfinamdai, 3,600 years ago. Because of her glittering finery and her seemingly high status within her community, Hayam and his colleague, Roshani Thosarat, and I need to brush up on my tie, Roshani Thosarat dubbed her the princess. Based on the quality of the pottery and the strength of the women's wrist muscles, the archaeologists concluded she was likely a master potter. A man of similar age buried nearby was decorated with 56,000 beads, a turtle shell carapace, and a pottery vessel. More sinister, a shallow grave to her right contained a headless male. But woman's status may also have been reflected in the details of her grave. Though her grave faced eastward, like others at the site, it was larger and deeper than most others in the burial area. The bodies within the burial mound reflect the ability of hunter-gatherer societies to adapt to environmental changes. The first settlement was on the bank of a mangrove-lined estuary that offered a rich diet of marine animals. When the sea level fell, men in the community stopped paddling canoes as evidenced by the abrupt decrease in upper body strength in the bodies from that era. When there were more plentiful fresh water, the residents made agricultural tools for growing crops. Archaeologists offer differing views on whether the family group descended from coastal hunter-gatherers or immigrant rice farmers of inland groups. It is unclear what role the princess actually played within her community, and some experts dislike the moniker because it does not seem that the group had any kind of royal tradition. Nevertheless, the generations of burials show meaningful rituals. The dig at Kokfinamdai, I can't talk at all, preserved evidence of a family that clearly clung to tradition and buried its dead with items that had mattered during their lives. There she is. Let me look closer. My goodness, that's amazing. There's the headless man. Let's move on to Gnosis' cryptic tablets, 1750 to 1490 BCE in Crete. They're Minoan and Mycenaean. In a labyrinthine palace, Arthur Evans discovered tablets scrawled with Europe's oldest written language, which would stump scholars for decades. After Mycenae was excavated in mainland Greece in the late 19th century, a trail of discovery for the heroic Bronze Age led southward across the Aegean to the island of Crete, the legendary home of King Minos. Oh dear, not again. Let's go for Minos because they're Minoan. And like the Minotaur and all that. Unmistakable clues that something very ancient was to be found there, in the form of huge pithoi, or storage jars for grain or olive oil or wine, had come to light on a hill called Kephala, just south of Heraklion, thanks to a short-lived excavation by a Greek amateur archaeologist, Minos Kyrinos. German businessman turned archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, the excavator of Troy and Mycenae, attempted to buy the site, as others had before him, but the price was exorbitant, and Crete was governed by a Turkish administration not disposed to approve the excavation. After Schliemann withdrew, Kephala was bought by a British man named Arthur Evans, who was wealthy, well-educated, and filled with a lively curiosity about an unknown script that he had seen on some Cretan sealstones in Athens. Like other scholars, Evans had been surprised that Schliemann found no evidence of writing among the ruins of Mycenae's advanced civilization. Was it possible that such masterpieces were the work of man before writing, Evans wrote. Such a conclusion I could not bring myself to accept. He hoped he might be able to resolve the conundrum in Crete. In 1900, after Crete gained political autonomy, Evans started to open ground at Kephala and discovered the totally unsuspected splendors of Knossos. An entire previously unknown civilization of vast material accomplishment and artistic achievement was now revealed. A labyrinth indeed, the complex Evans uncovered, which he called Palace of Minos, had hundreds of rooms and was bigger than Buckingham Palace. Few would have been surprised had Evans announced that in the midst of the maze he had found the bones of the Minotaur. The Minoans flourished between 2000 and 1500 BCE. Ships of this first maritime empire dominated the commerce of the eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea, where copper and tin were traded for the all-important production of bronze. Later archaeological excavations revealed that Crete was highly urbanized by this time, with Knossos perhaps the most dominant center. Evans's vast labors at Knossos extended over 25 years. Not content with unearthing the palace, he reconstructed it in parts, a procedure the more meticulous archaeologists would later scorn, yet one that has helped make Knossos an international tourist attraction for those who want to experience the Minoan world. What an alluring world it was, wrote Joseph Judge, a National Geographic editor who visited Crete for a 1978 article, with its bull-leaping spectacles, its lithesome men, and handsome bare-breasted women, its great goddess with her snakes and doves and dances in the sacred groves, and its essential peace. We know of not a single fortified Minoan site. The lack of defensive infrastructure or military garrisons led scholars to believe that the Minoan age marked a peaceful era on the Aegean Sea. More recent excavations have uncovered Minoan fortifications. Regardless, any stretches of peace and prosperity the Minoans enjoyed came to an abrupt halt. At the zenith of its power and brilliance in the 15th century BCE, the Minoan civilization collapsed in flames. The end was so sudden and emphatic that some scholars initially attributed it to the volcanic eruption at Santorini, some 70 miles north of Crete, though newer scientific evidence suggests that this natural disaster happened a century or more earlier. Others cite the all-too-familiar pattern of aggression and plunder by invaders bent on conquest, perhaps the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, who we know later took over Knossos before its final destruction. Absolutely gorgeous, right? Speaking of beautiful. Perhaps far greater than Evans's discovery of an alabaster throne, expressive wall paintings and wooden columns at Knossos was his discovery of clay tablets scrawled with the hieroglyph-type script and filed away in boxes like bureaucratic records. Evans later wrote that finding this writing at Knossos was the dramatic fulfillment of my most sanguine expectations. Some of the tablets were written in what Evans called Linear A still undeciphered form of writing. Most of the tablets were marked with a script Evans labeled Linear B and dated to the later Mycenaean occupation of the site. This early written form of Greek would remain undecipherable for decades, despite the persistent work of scholars and amateur codebreakers, and Evans would die in 1941 before getting the chance to read the enigmatic tablets. The Yale instructor and military cryptanalyst, that's a great word, military cryptanalyst Emmett L. Bennett Jr. Military cryptanalyst Emmett L. Bennett Jr. What a sentence. Made great strides by cataloging the Linear B signs into a definitive list of about 80 syllables, and an American classics professor, Alice Kober, came extremely close to cracking the code before her death in 1950. A passionate amateur, English architect Michael Ventris finally deciphered Linear B in 1952. Inscriptions in this ancient language have been found beyond Knossos at Mycenae, Thebes, Pylos, and other centers of the Mycenaean world. Ventris thought the translated script would be Etruscan or an indigenous Cretan language, but was surprised to find that theory was incorrect. He described his breakthrough to BBC Radio. During the last 2 weeks, I've suddenly come to the conclusion that the Knossos and Pylos tablets must after all be written in Greek. a difficult and archaic Greek, seeing that it's written 500 years older than Homer, and written in a rather abbreviated form, but Greek nonetheless. Once I made this assumption, most of the peculiarities of the language and spelling, which had puzzled me, seemed to find a logical explanation. And although many of the tablets remain as incomprehensible as before, many others are suddenly beginning to make sense. The translation revealed no great works of literature. The Gnosis tablets held mostly mundane administrative records, such as lists of livestock, commodities, and land leases. But cracking the riddle of the labyrinth opened the door to many more possibilities. The tablets document a pivotal moment just before the destruction of palatial centers across the Mediterranean like Gnosis, known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. Archaeologists cannot fully explain this phenomenon, but it ushered in a dark age in the Aegean for several centuries before ancient Greek culture would reach another apex in the Classical Age. These writings at Gnosis are witness to the everyday interactions of Mycenaeans just before the world as they knew it went to ruin. We are still awaiting the answer to what language the Linear A tablets bear, however. Perhaps their eventual decipherment will help solve the mystery of the origins of the Minoan civilization. The Law Code of Hammurabi, circa 1792 to 1750 BCE in Susa, Iran. It's Babylonian. If I have some time, I gotta tell you about me and Hammurabi. We go way back. Yeah, I think we'll have some time. Let me just do it real quick. So, I was in 6th grade, 12 years old. We were given random topics to discuss in the ancient world, and I was given Hammurabi's code, and I had to write like a 4-paragraph paper about it. And I couldn't find any cool facts about it other than like it was a stone written by Hammurabi that had laws on it. And I was so mad at it, and I hated it. And much later, when I was 18, I went to the Louvre and looked down the hallway, and I saw this, and I went, "Oh, you!" And I ran over, and I was like, I was so mad at you. When I was 12 years old, I recognized it instantly. Now I love it. It's okay, Hammurabi. I'm not mad at you anymore. Let's read more about it. The Law Code of Hammurabi. I have a photo of me with it somewhere. I'll dig it up one day and show you guys. Anyway, etched into a stone monument, it's one of history's most famous set of laws. A towering monument to a Babylonian king's sense of justice. The Code of Hammurabi is one of history's oldest and most influential bodies of law, inscribed on an imposing 7.4-foot tall basalt stela. Hammurabi's laws offer a tantalizing view to everyday life in the Mesopotamian civilization of the First Babylonian Empire. The black basalt artifact was discovered in 1901 by Swiss archaeologist Gustave Jacquier, a member of a French delegation excavating in the ancient city of Susa, located at the crossroads of several great civilizations dating to prehistory. The archaeologists found a treasure trove of artifacts and managed to snag exclusive rights to display the Monterey Convention with the Shah, who only charged them for the gold and silver artifacts. Covered in cuneiform script, the stela is now held by the Louvre, where the expedition leader Jacques de Morgan brought it. Its text was decoded and first translated from Akkadian to French by Jean-Vincent Schiele, a Dominican priest and noted Assyriologist in 1902. It is thought to be one of several similar stelae erected in cities ruled by Hammurabi, a member of the nomadic Amorite tribes and the Babylonian Empire's first major king, who ruled from about 1792 to 1750 BCE. Regardless of where it first stood, the stela was brought to Susa as plunder by Shutruk-Nahunte, a rival Elamite king, in the 12th century BCE. By the time it was recovered in modern times, it had been broken into 3 pieces. Though the original location of the stela is unknown, Hammurabi's profound legacy is not. During his reign, the king expanded the city-state of Babylon into an empire by conquering neighboring cities. Along the way, he developed an ongoing interest in his people's legal disputes and recognized the law as a tool to consolidate power. His lengthy codex covered everything from standard wages to domestic disputes and violent crimes. Its purpose, he declared poetically, was to cause justice to rise like the sun over the people and to light up the land. The magnificence of the stela and its public display were carefully calculated to reinforce the eminence and divinity of the king and to ensure his memory was preserved. Such imposing stones were erected in temples, but the codes are also copied onto stone tablets and circulated throughout the empire. The carving at the top of the example in the Louvre shows the sun deity Shamash seated on a throne as he gifts Hammurabi the symbols of sovereignty and justice. The inscription urges people with legal disputes to meet beneath the image of the king standing before Shamash, hear the words of his code, and pray to him. Let him read the inscription and understand my precious words, the stela reads. Let him see his judgment. Let his heart become soothed. Hammurabi's laws weren't the first in the ancient world, but their age and their impressive number, 282 total, made the discovery at Susa exceptionally valuable. The infamous concept of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, is brutish by today's standards, but it mirrors the style of justice by retribution common at the time. Babylonian values and customs are evident in these civil laws. Corn, oil, and cattle come up repeatedly as important commodities that were used as wages and currency. In an interesting preview of labor economics, standard wages fluctuated based on effort and productivity. For instance, day laborers received a marginal bump in pay during long hot summer days. Laws dictate the rights of concubines, apprentices, and enslaved people, all common positions in ancient Mesopotamia. Men who couldn't pay their loans could gain a temporary reprieve by washing their debt tablet in water, evidence of both loan forgiveness and a written system for keeping records. The code was not intended as a democratic equalizer. It reflects the status-driven hierarchy of Babylonian society. It favored people of wealth and rank, who were required only to pay a fine if they injured or killed an individual of a lower class. If a physician healed a man's broken bone, the patient owed his doctor 5 shekels. But if the healer accidentally killed a patient of high status during an operation, his hands would be cut off. The code also favored men over women. For instance, adultery by a husband might go unpunished, but an unfaithful wife would be executed. Despite such inequities, the laws promulgated by Hammurabi offered certain protections to women, commoners, and enslaved people, and promised that his law ensured that the strong may not oppress the weak. Wives could sue an adulterous husband for divorce, and a man divorcing his wife had to pay her a settlement or return the marriage dowry. If a man had a child with an enslaved woman, he was not required to leave the child an inheritance, but both mother and child were entitled to freedom. All defendants were somewhat shielded from false testimony by a law prescribing the death penalty for witnesses who committed perjury. Hammurabi's dynasty lasted only a few generations before it toppled, but his code of law set a vital and enduring precedent. Putting laws in writing discouraged judges from ruling arbitrarily and promoted the idea of justice as universal. As the king conquered new lands, people with different customs and conceptions of justice were united under one code, common laws that discouraged them from taking the law into their own hands. Future emperors, from Augustus Caesar to Napoleon Bonaparte, would replicate this strategy. Today, Hammurabi imperiously oversees justice served from a marble frieze in the U.S. Supreme Court. At the bottom of the stela, Hammurabi condemns all future kings who ignore his rules. May their destinies be cursed, their kingdoms overthrown, their people scattered, their very existence forgotten. The effects of the curse remain to be seen, but one thing is certain. Thanks to this stone monument for justice, Hammurabi will never be forgotten. and the Minoan Pompeii, and I think that's the last one. Let me double check. Yeah, that's going to be the last one for tonight. The Minoan Pompeii, back to the Minoan civilization, circa 1600 BCE in Santorini, Greece. Buried beneath volcanic debris, Akrotiri provides vivid glimpses into everyday life during the Bronze Age's glittering zenith. In the piercing Aegean sunlight, the Greek island of Santorini, also called Thera, can seem a dream of stillness and peace. It is not. The island and its satellites are the shattered shell of a mighty and still active volcano. In past epochs, Thera has subsided, and erupted again, visiting death and devastation upon a wide area. The sea has flooded through the blasted crater walls that now form Thera's Bay. So deep is this old crater, or caldera, 1,300 feet in places, that ships cannot anchor in it. More than 3,500 years ago, Thera blew its top in one of the biggest eruptions humans witnessed in the past 10,000 years. The mammoth upheaval darkened the sky, created a tidal wave, and cloaked the island with layers of pumice and ash as thick as 200 feet. Buried under the volcanic debris near the south coast of Thera is the ancient site of Akrotiri. The Minoan town was destroyed in the disaster and possibly inspired the legend of the lost city of Atlantis. It's also one of the best preserved prehistoric settlements in Europe, with private homes, workshops, and spectacular artworks fixed in time like an Aegean Pompeii. The seafaring, copper-trading Minoan civilization that dominated the eastern Mediterranean, the Bronze Age, long before the Greek or Roman empires, was born just 70 miles to the south on Crete. For generations, archaeologists have attempted to find the cause of its mysterious demise. In the 1930s, Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos theorized that an eruption on Thera was to blame for the Minoan cradle's demise, since a tsunami triggered by the blast could have flooded and destroyed much of it. World War II and the Greek Civil War delayed Marinatos' search for direct proof of the strange, sinister island of Thera. In 1967, he finally began a systematic excavation in a ravine near Akrotiri, then a poor and remote village without electricity or a road connecting it to the other towns on the island. Santorini, now synonymous with glamorous vacations, was still years away from its major tourist boom. In the 19th century, a French company mining pumice unearthed prehistoric buildings and pottery at Akrotiri, and archaeologists found scattered artifacts in the area. But Marinatos' discoveries offered an unprecedented glimpse into everyday life for a wealthy outpost of Minoan Crete. Within the first few hours of digging on a hot summer day, Marinatos and his crew discovered loose stones with fragments of imported Cretan pottery he thought had been made sometime around 1520 to 1500 BCE. Soon those loose stones became recognizable as the crumbled walls of the upper story of a building. In the rubble they found a stone lamp with traces of soot. Clearly it had been burning just before the catastrophe. As excavations expanded over the years, a veritable city was revealed. Ancient Akrotiri had public squares, homes that reached up to 3 stories, and sophisticated infrastructure like paved streets and a sewer system with clay pipes that linked private water installations, including toilets. The walls of many buildings stand just as they did when their inhabitants fled more than 3,500 years ago. Ours is the privilege not of excavating the usual decayed ruin, but of exploring a town abandoned and obliterated in the space of a few weeks, Marinatos observed. Wow. Monkeys. Cool. In their homes, people left behind wooden furniture, ceramic storage jars, and food. Sea urchins, beans, onions, sesame seeds, snails, ground barley, olive oil, that now offer clues about the ancient diet. Fine pottery and other imports prove that people at Akrotiri had contacts not just with Crete, but also with the Greek mainland, Cyprus, Syria, and Egypt. Inscriptions in Linear A, one of the earliest writing systems found in Europe, show that at least some people were literate. Metal weapons, tools, utensils, and jewelry are rare discoveries at Akrotiri, as are human skeletons, a sign that people living here had time to save not only themselves, but also some of their valuables before the city was destroyed. Crumbled walls buried beneath layers of volcanic debris suggest that earthquakes in the weeks leading up to the most devastating phases of the eruption tipped off residents to their city's impending doom. The individual artifacts pale against Akrotiri's most stunning finds, though. Murals that survived remarkably intact and still brightly colored beneath ash. The most famous scenes include lilies and swallows in a lively springtime landscape, boys wearing boxing gloves as they fight, and seafarers setting out on long, narrow ships. The wall paintings are valued not only for their artistic merit, but also for their wealth of information about the natural world. For example, depictions of antelope and scenes of blue monkeys ambling up Thar's hills suggest that these animals, now found only in East Africa, once roamed this island and those nearby. Contrary to Marinatos's theory, there's no evidence that Thar's eruption brought a swift end to Crete's glory. But the cataclysm may have had rippling negative effects on the Minoan economy, and Crete went into decline by the late 15th century BCE. After Marinatos died suddenly in an accident at Akrotiri in 1974, archaeologist Christos Doumas took over and became the longtime director of excavations at the site. Most of the city is still buried under hardened layers of ash, and as more of it is uncovered, a mystery endures. When did the eruption occur? The disaster could be an important anchor in time for archaeologists to establish chronologies across the ancient Mediterranean, but pinpointing a date has been a notoriously difficult task. Archaeological evidence, radiocarbon analysis, and tree ring and ice core data have all offered various possibilities between 1700 BCE and 1500 BCE. The exact date remains as elusive as the cause for the Minoan civilization's demise. That's it for tonight. Looks like next we're going to be looking at some awesome Egyptian-style jewelry. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and